come from Gapminder, and we are a non-profit who works for a fact-based worldview everyone can understand. And we've been working together for 18 years, and the general thing we do actually is that we fight 3 mega misconceptions, and we do that all the time, whatever we do. And the first mega misconception is that people think that the world is divided in two, which is not. They think the world is getting worse, which is not in many of the indicators you can measure over time. And they think the population just keeps growing. But when you look at the forecasts from the UN, you will see that is not completely true. So basically, this is what we're doing. So the 3 questions, I was the one asking them for you. And the reason is because I was curious to know what you thought about it. And we've been asking these questions in several different audiences. Just a few weeks back, we got back results from measuring 12 countries, the general public, on these questions and a few others. And I'm going to share with you the results and see how you did. So the first question was worldwide. 30-year-old men have spent 10 years in school on average. How many years have women of the same age spent in school? And the correct answer is 9. Looking at Sweden, how it performed when we did the test, 18% of the Swedes were guessing that or knowing that, depending on what you think. And compared to some of the other countries, we didn't do very well, but at least we were not in the bottom. But if we would just have guessed randomly, because we had 3 alternatives, we would have gotten 33% right. And it's only Korea and Hungary who got that on this question. Sweden is not there at all. And wondering now how we have actually measured in 3 other media conferences the same question. So let's start by humiliating them. So here we have the Swedish results, and we have been asking like a media conference in the European, 14% right, worse than the general public in Sweden. Documentary filmers, 11% right, even worse. And then US media, 4% right on this question, 4%. So the general public in Sweden is actually pretty good off. So what about you? Well, this is your result. You're almost as good as a normal Swede, right? 84% still don't get it. So, and how many of the world's 1-year-old children today have been vaccinated against some disease? 80% is the correct answer. Swedes thought 21%, pretty good off. Still not as good as a chimp, just guessing. This is what the other media conferences were saying. US media on par with Swedes, general public. Media in Europe, only 6%. And what about you? 24%, a little bit better than the Swedish general public, but still not as good as if you would have just guessed. And then we have the third question. There are 2 billion children in the world today, aged 0 to 15. How many children will there be in year 2100 according to the UN? 2, 3, or 4 billion? The correct answer is 2. The Swedes, only 8% got this right, while Korea, pretty good off, even beating the chimp, Japan as well. The other media conferences, well, they were actually better than Swedes in general, a lot better. Not media in Europe, though. So what about you here? 14%. Still 86% getting it wrong. So the reason I'm not thinking that you should know this, but the interesting thing is that you systematically get it wrong and systematically think the world is worse than it actually is. So you can see a pattern, and when media as well think that, that's a pretty fascinating thing, isn't it? So if we look at the test we did, we went to 12 countries asking about 14,000 people. And looking at how many do you think got 0 right on these questions? All of them were A, B, and C questions, like the ones you saw. Those were 3 of the questions. 15% scored 0, not even like 1 or 2. And this is how the results were divided. 1 got 11 rights, and that was a Swede. And nobody got 12 rights of these 12 questions, with 3 answer alternatives per question. So this is what the chimp would get, right? And only 10% of the people we asked, of the 14,000 people, was better than a monkey. So how is this? Well, if we ask the general public, other studies have asked what people think about the world. And usually, many people think actually the world is getting worse. And I think that is why we get these very strange results. That was in Swedish, the second one. Then you learned a little bit of Swedish as well. Wonderful. So what is the world like then? Well, here is the continents. Just the basics. There are 7 billion people in the world. 1 live in Americas, 1 in Africa, 1 in Europe, and 4 in Asia. We have asked this question as well, actually, and people get wrong here as well. So to remember what the world population is divided, you can use the PIN code 1114 to remember. And this is what it's going to be in the future. UN is expecting 3 more billions in Africa, 1 more billion in Asia, and no more in Africa or in Americas or Europe. So what we usually think about as the West is this minor fraction of the world population, 8%, while most people are actually here. And looking at what happened over time, we can see here we have the regions of the world in 2015. It's by income. So the mountain is how many people live on different income levels. If we go back in time to the 1800, you can see a line here saying if you're below poverty line or not. So you can see most of the population was actually below the poverty line at this point. If we slide very rapidly into the future, you can see the time ticking. You can see how the mountains are increasing because the population grows, and you can see here how Europe and Americas are moving out of the poverty, right? And look here what's happened recently. You see? It's a quick and constant movement. To understand the world, we cannot think of it as static. What we learned in school, we can no longer use because the world is constantly changing. We can look here as well. This is a bubble chart where you can see all the countries of the world. The size is how many people live in the country, and each bubble is a country. It's colored by the region. So the pink here are Asian countries, meaning that this one is China and this is India. On this axis, the standing axis, you have life expectancy. On the other, you have economy. So up in this corner here, you can expect to be somewhat healthy and rich, you could say, in a world perspective, while down here, you're more sick and poor. If we go back in time, you see now it says 2015 in the background. Going back to year 1800, see how the countries are disappearing. Back then, no country was as good as the worst off countries of today. So the world is actually changing all the time. But what do we see in media? Because there is a problem we realize. We have been doing these visualizations of data for so many times, but we realize people don't really like data. Doesn't matter if you make them colorful and moving, people can spot it's actually statistics, and a lot of people look away. So instead they are basing their opinions on the media, right? So in the media, what do we see? We see disasters, wars, refugees, diseases, strange minorities. We see beaches, cute animals, weird cultures. And all of that together is what we use to create our worldview. And that makes it pretty weird because media, as you all know, is basically talking about everything that is extraordinary and uncommon, right? And we just take all these uncommon things, and that makes the worldview we have. So we thought maybe we should do it in another way. So imagine the world as a street where you have the poorest to the left, the richest to the right, and everybody else somewhere in between. Where would you think that you live? We have asked this question too, And in Sweden, people generally think that they are in the middle of the world income distribution, while looking at the data, you're actually at the top. So how can you understand the world, looking at media, seeing all these extraordinary things, thinking that you are in the middle of the income while you're at the top? Pretty tricky. We decided to send photographers to homes all over the world. In each home, they look at how people sleep, how they eat, and what toys they have, and about 135 other things. I'm just going to show you briefly. This is what it looks like. You have the street at the top, and it says families in the world by income. We can visually change to front doors here. If I could spell, that is. I can. Wonderful. And then we can visually browse. So we sorted, so all the poorer homes to the left, the richer to the right, and everybody else are sorted like this. We can now go into the homes. We can look at beds, for instance. And we can instantly see the world using photos as data, but just visually browsing to see what everyday life might be, in contrast to the images in the media in general. Remember, the Swedes thought they were in the middle, so we can do a nasty thing. We can actually filter this one to the middle income segment on the street, and now we can think, is this what the Swedes are thinking their bedroom is like? I would guess not. We can go down. Doesn't look like this either, to the poorer end. Or up here, starts to look pretty much Swedish, doesn't it? Even though these homes are in China, Netherlands, South Korea, and so on. We can now do my favorite, look at toilets. It's very seldom you can do that, right? So here we see the world by toilets. And see, they are pretty much the same, aren't they? But remember, we're in the top income. So let's slide out the street and see all the toilets we have here. And we get a completely different image. So this is a set of imagery that is free for anyone to use and anyone to contribute to. And it's called Dollar Street. So this is what you can do with it. But you can also, basically, not everything works as a photo, right? So we also ask a lot of questions in these homes about things you cannot see in a photo. Do you own your house? How long do you go and get to get water? Do you have power outages? How often? And so forth. And then there are a few things you do in the home that is actually activities. So we actually also take photos of everyday activities. I'm going to show you a short snippet of toothbrushing. Starting at the top, here, see if I can, yeah. And see here how people are using toothpaste and plastic toothbrush. Even though we go down the street, it looks pretty much the same. Some are very serious, I admit, but otherwise she's doing the same thing, right? But coming down here to the poorer end of the street, you will start seeing people brushing with a stick, for instance, or a finger. So this woman in Malawi, she scrapes some mud off from her wall and she mixes with water and then she brushes with her finger, which means that we tag this image not only as her wall, but also as her toothpaste. And then we can use toothpasting to segment how people live. So the poorer end, you will brush with a finger or a stick. In the middle, you will have a plastic toothbrush. And at the top, you will have one each. So you don't have to share with your grandma anymore, and people tend to like that. We can look at US, for instance. Here, we have in the richer end, the family Howard. And we can compare with the family on the lower end in the US, it's Hadley's. And we can see the difference looking into the cutlery drawer immediately. We can add another family in the middle. And looking at the cutlery drawer, we can see the gradual change from having a plastic box to a wooden box with compartments. We can look at kitchen sinks, living rooms, and we can do the same in China. 3 families, 3 homes, there are sofas, there are cooking. Cool thing is when we start comparing across, I think. So we take 2 families we already seen, the Woods and the Howards. They were at the upper end of the street. They are neighbors at this Dollar Street. We can go into their bedroom and it looks pretty much the same. They have leather sofas, identical play structures, both made in China. And we can go to the other end, to Nigeria, and we can look here. These 2 families doesn't look to have much in common, do they? But they have the same type of ceiling, same type of sofas, store their grains in identical manners, they're going to have fish for dinner, and they cook their water in identical ways. So cultural stereotypes and country stereotypes doesn't really make sense to understand the world. It's looking at the economic distribution that will make sense. So a quick review here, looking at the upper end, we can see some similarities in different parts of the world. Shoes, sofas in US and Sweden, fruits, hairbrushes, bookshelves, toilet paper, wardrobes, lamps, dogs, floor, soap, washing, clocks, computers, phones, and so forth. It doesn't look like the media images we get, do it? So this is what we see in the media, right? It's like everything is getting worse, plastic bags will kill you all, see cute children cry, found dead birds, you know, this kind of things all the time. So I think we should actually add this one, like we do on the cigarettes. Remember that news usually make this thing sounds more alarming than they actually are. This kind of setting, I think that would make sense because it makes our minds go crazy when we see all these bad things. And it's like we have an attention filter and it's only the worst things that passes. So we see gaps in the news all the time and we think, ooh, it's huge differences and it's increasing. But you should look for the majority. You see the negativity, it's just getting worse. But usually, wouldn't an improvement get publicity? Most likely not, right? We see how trends just continue, but probably the curve might bend, just like it does with height, for instance, for small kids. They don't continue to grow forever, that speed as infants, right? And we're afraid of things. Help, help, help. And what are the risks? We need to start calculating and being more statistical driven. And importance, it's a huge problem. We very often, compared to what? We very often see a number and we get stressed. This is dead infants, it says. So 4 million dead infants in 2016. But in 2015, it was even worse. And in 1950, much worse. So we have to always put these proportions. And we tend to think that the others look weird, but we should always remember what problem do they solve. Just like with the cooking, you could see it was identical in China and Nigeria, because on that income, that is how you cook, even though you might have different dress codes. And we tend to think that everything is static, even though most things are actually changing slowly. Like, for instance, we had Polish women had a hard time now coming to Sweden to do abortions because it's illegal in Poland. But going back to 1960, it was the other way around. Then it was illegal here, and we went to Poland. And then we think about single solutions, and we should think about more combining tools to understand the world. And blaming, we tend to always find someone to blame. And nowadays, I think everyone can agree it's most likely Trump, isn't it? But is there other explanations? Maybe there are. Not in his case, maybe, but you know. And then we always tend to think now or never. It's so important, but we might need to take small steps. So we should use these sort of rules of thumbs to actually reduce our stress when we are consuming media. Doesn't say we should not consume media. And the media is not trying to fool us, because if they were trying to fool us, they would have scored totally wonderful on all our measures, and then they would sort of do it just by being evil, right? But they score as bad as the general public or worse on our knowledge questions, meaning they're most likely always doing their best, so we should actually just increase what we know. We skip that. So remembering this one, 15% got 0% right on our 12 questions. And it was only 10% that was better than the monkey. So I think the important thing is we should solve these mega misconceptions. We need to add some facts. The world is not divided in two. The world is not getting worse on most things, and population is actually halting. It will not continue to grow. And I think these three misconceptions are the ones who makes us so afraid usually. So what we need a framework to understand the world and to put all this news into some kind of easy to understand context. And we need to use these factfulness thinking rules where we try to control our fears and very quick reactions. And what we should do is actually, I'm telling you here, we are actually doing certification of organizations and schools and companies and so forth. You should take the 12 questions so that your organization can show that at least you know as much as the chimps about the world, not less. And maybe at least as much as the general public, not less. Otherwise it might be a bit embarrassing. So please take the questions. We can do it online on our website, and it's pretty easy, right? So thank you. 3 minutes over time, I'm sorry. It was because talking about the swimming pool. Thank you.